Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the May 11th work session of the Ann Arbor City Council. Mr. Crawford.
Good evening, Mayor. We have two presentations for you tonight. The first one is from Assistant City Administrator John Fournier, assisted by Kirk Crawford from GCSI, and they'll be presenting on your legislative policy update.
Thank you.
I take it that's my cue.
It is.
You have the floor.
Forgive me. You all have a look at your screen. We'll share a brief PowerPoint here. So we want to speak to all of you members of council tonight. Thank you for having me. And I want to also introduce Kirk Profit and Gary Owen from GCSI, the lobbying firm the city employs. Thank you, Kirk and Gary, for being here. So we're gonna do a quick overview of some topics of interest in Lansing, especially related to state revenue, and a discussion generally of the environment in Lansing. And I'll hand it over to Kirk and to Gary if you guys want to give us your thoughts on this section.
Well, thank you, John, and thanks for the opportunity to continue with the city. You guys are, as you know, but it's good to say for any of the public that's listening, you guys are leaders in the state typically on all manners of municipal and public thought, and we appreciate the opportunity to be part of that team. It is indeed a strange time in Lansing. The legislature really hasn't met. They've met sort of, on a couple of occasions, but they broke because of COVID and the pandemic right about March 11th, March 12th. So it's been close to 2 months now. And we've pretty much operated under emergency orders, as you know, the most recent being 2059, and then the additional pieces that come out in it to help explain and further elaborate on particular pieces of that general order. And as you know, the executive order ability and statute has been challenged by the legislature. So now we got a bit of a fight in Lansing about who has the authority to do this sort of activity. It's in court. The pleadings have been filed, and it's caused a bit of contentiousness, as you might imagine, between the executive and the legislative offices. But the reality is the governor is continuing to govern as the statutes, both of them require under emergency declarations. And we expect that to continue for a while. I think the reality is, as you've seen, things will continue to change even with each of those broader executive orders. You saw this week construction begin again, and you'll continue to see, I think, as the trend lines continue more favorably, a continuing approach to more activity being permissible under these declarations. And as always, in any of those, we worked recently with John on a piece, and Tom, who are concerned about even this sort of activity where we're trying to be responsive to the Open Meeting Act and disclosure and sunshine laws and that sort of thing. And you guys have done a great job, but it's been awkward a little bit doing it on 2-week pieces. And to her credit, in response to John and Tom's request, the governor responded with an extension of that piece through the end of June. So the point of that is obviously to give some credit to John and Tom for trying to get a better handle on how to proceed with these sorts of activities, but also that when you have issues, we can try to see if we can impact them with the executive office. And my experience with the governor is she's going to keep public health and the economy in foremost focus, but she will work with these kind of requests as she can. So I would encourage it. Continuing on that a little bit, as you would guess, COVID and emerging now, the budget are going to consume most of the oxygen in Lansing. John has a number of pieces that he's been pursuing with us legislatively, but again, there's been really no legislative activity on anything other than COVID since March, the beginning of March. And even then it was starting to be, the oxygen was starting to be consumed by budget. And so as we go forward, that's likely to be the case. We're going to continue to watch for opportunities I would recognize legislatively before this pandemic, we were able to complete with the support of John and Tom and previously Howard and several of you on council, the treatment of solar panels for residential use. So that was a good piece to finally finish after several years of confusion over the treatment of it. I would remind folks that we will have a budget, a revenue estimate on May 15th at the end of this week. That will help to drive the budget deliberations a little more with a little better definition. The budget is statutorily due now after legislation that was passed last year. It is statutorily due on the governor's desk by July 1st. And I think it's still the legislature's intent. We had a conference call with some subcommittee chairs on the budget earlier today. And I believe it's still their intent to do just that. It's certainly condensed and a shortened period of time they have to deal with it in kind of strange circumstances. But that is still their intent to complete by July 1st. Having said that, we do expect that they will announce another extraordinary special revenue estimate to be delivered in August. So you would anticipate, even with the completion of the budget July 1st, if that does happen, multiple supplemental budgets to go on through the course of the year that may adjust the different spending features. Just in terms of numbers, I would remind us, and again, I think Tom and John and your budget team have a pretty good handle on this, but the city right now gets close to $2 million from fire protection grants that you guys led the way to secure over the last few years, and that piece should be secure. Revenue sharing, you get about 10.2 from constitutional revenue sharing and about 1.7 from statutory. Constitutional revenue sharing is largely sales tax, and as you know, that's going to be impacted by this economy and what's happened with COVID. So you would anticipate some sort of adjustment in that piece. The constitutional piece should be protected, surprisingly, and it's been more at risk through the course of time. But in the short term here, that 1.7 should be protected. Additionally, your Act 51 dollars are going to be impacted again because that's fuel taxes and registration fees. I suspect registration fees have held pretty constant, but fuel taxes are obviously dramatically impacted. So you would anticipate your Act 51 payments to be impacted. With that, there's also, I think we've been expecting for a while, actually some marijuana money. And Gary Owen is with me today on the Zoom. And I don't know, Gary, if you want to add a few comments to the lay of the land in Lansing and also say a little bit about marijuana.
Sure. And we clarified this briefly, earlier with the state treasurer and House fiscal, but the way that some of those fees work is with the transition from medical to recreational cannabis, it will allow for 0% excise fee on all medical sales and will transition to a 10% excise fee in recreational. And when the state did this, they anticipated a lot more cities than have to date transition to recreational right away. And so cities like Detroit and other areas that will have a large number of facilities have remained in the medical market. And so the way that the legislation was actually written is that it's actually a ballot initiative was actually written was the first 20 million is taken off the top. All state departments must be taken care of. And then the monies will flow to the cities based on the number of facilities and traditional revenue sharing type annual payments sometime in October. And so what we don't know is what those numbers will look like. What we don't know is what those state departments will claim as costs. And of course, in year one here, there'll be several adjustments based on reactions from cities, based on reactions from legislators on how those dollars are divvied up. And I'm sure that'll be an ever evolving process as folks do some checks and balances on, what the departments actually need versus what they're claiming as far as startup costs and things that go into launching such a large bureaucratic effort to get these facilities licensed, et cetera. Ann Arbor being one of the first, will collect probably a large chunk of the early excise money and I'm unsure about some of the other cities, how many facilities they have and how that will be divvied up. For example, a city like Detroit will have somewhere between 75 and 100 retail, and then several more of the processing, cultivation, etc. Whereas city of Ann Arbor would have closer to 18, 20 retail, some cultivation, some processing, a lab or two, etc. And so those will all come out. We'll have a report basically in October, and then we'll certainly need impact. Your reaction to take back and get some feedback into Treasury on how we feel about the way that they've set up the system. I think in year one of a long-term system, that'll be important. And then those final rules have been submitted to the legislature, so that is what a lot of cities have been waiting for. And that final rule package is before the legislature now, and should be approved here relatively shortly, which will give folks some more long-term understanding of what the regulatory system looks like. Any other topics you'd like me to cover, Kirk? I don't want to
Let's
mess up
stop
your
there for
flow.
a minute. These Zooms can be a challenge because you can't really read body language or to see if somebody is, we can monotone it for too long. So should we stop there, John, or are there a few more comments we should make first, or how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, I think that's the extent of what we had discussed. You all presenting it. It might be appropriate if there are. Well, you know what? I can go through and discuss the legislation that the city's been specifically pursuing, and then maybe we can take a pause after that. How does that sound? So I just want to speak briefly. Kirk had and Gary had touched on this. The legislature's work has come to a crawl. Really, there is some committee work that's moving forward. As you've seen, there are some floor sessions that have been called, but unless there's some kind of movement from the legislature to adopt virtual meeting rules, or there's some other method that the legislature can meet in the future, I would anticipate that until we come to some kind of turning point with the pandemic, that work in the legislature is probably going to be very slow during this period. So keeping that in mind, I just wanted to run through some of the bills that we've been focusing on in Ann Arbor. The upshot for council is that since the last report I provided you on legislative activity, there's been no movement on any of these bills. I think I last had reported to you all in January, and of course shortly thereafter things were frozen because of the pandemic. A few updates worth noting. As you recall, last year during the lame duck session, there was work to stop the vegetation preemption bills, as they're called. There's some talk about these bills being reintroduced into the legislature. Nothing has been introduced at this point, but it is worth noting that a federal court did just invalidate the Township of Canton's Heritage Tree Ordinance. And so I have referred that to the city attorney's office, and they're looking at what kind of an impact that might have on the city of Ann Arbor. But there, whenever there are courts decisions of this type, that has the potential to spur legislation. So we're going to keep our eyes open for that. On both dark stores and tax exemption of telecom equipment, those bills have been introduced. No hearings have been held at this point. The short-term rental zoning preemption legislation that the council has asked us to keep an eye on, that is still stalled in negotiations. The local plastic bag bans legislation has been introduced, but no hearing is scheduled. The increased school zone speeding fines has been introduced, but no hearing has been scheduled. The bill to allow greater local control of speed limits has been introduced, but no hearing has been scheduled. That bill, I'll just flag, we're hopeful that if legislative activity can resume to some kind of normal, that bill has a good chance of moving. On the community solar bill, HB 4995, that also has been introduced with no hearing scheduled. And then there's a series of bills here that Councilmember Hayner had asked us to keep an eye on. related to the loosening of gun restrictions. Almost all of these bills have gone nowhere. One of them, Bill 4020, passed the House, and that relates to concealed weapons, but it has not been assigned to a committee yet in the Senate. And so there's some doubt as to whether that bill has much of a future. And so, like I said, the bills that we're tracking and that we're working on, there really hasn't been an opportunity for much work to move forward on them since I last spoke to council on this legislation. But we're hopeful that things in Lansing can kind of settle into some kind of functional normal as we move further into this pandemic and legislative activity can. So at that point, I think that's the bulk of the presentation we have now. And if there are questions, that's fine. Really up to the mayor and Tom as to how you want to move forward.
If anybody has any questions, I don't have yet. I don't see any hands raised. Councilmember Bannister.
I was just wondering, thank you for all that information. I was just wondering if there were any further details on the preemption by the federal court of Canton's heritage tree ordinance. Just this saying the property owner had all the rights on that and the community.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Councilmember Bannister. What originally had spawned this legislative action in the lame duck session last year was a property owner in Canton who owns a substantial parcel of land, I believe off Michigan Avenue, and they went through and had cut down their trees without consulting with the township. And many communities in Michigan, including Ann Arbor, have heritage tree ordinances that require you to keep track of the size and type of trees, and you're allowed to move them and do whatever with them, but it's subject to some restrictions. There's some replanting restrictions, donations to tree planting funds that the local governments run, and this property owner in Canton didn't participate in any of those programs. So the property owner went to their representatives in the legislature and asked for legislation that would ban heritage tree ordinances. And that, and really the way the legislation was written, it would have banned any type of vegetation regulation, period. So for instance, if you were developing a property and the local jurisdiction said, well, you need some wetland mitigation here and some shade trees there, some property buffers, things like that, pretty common things in zoning and development, that all would have been illegal. And so a piece of legislation was introduced. There was quite an outcry during the lame duck session, and it ended up not passing. So the property owner who originally spawned this whole debate sued Canton Township in federal court, and the court decided just last week that Canton's heritage tree ordinance was illegal in some way. I'm not going to purport to be an attorney, but so there's a question now as to how this issue gets resolved in Ann Arbor and other communities in the legislature and what have you. So the one thing I can promise you is that the issue is not over with. But in terms of more legal detail, we're waiting analysis from the city attorney's office.
Thank you.
Councilor Ramlowy.
Thank you, and thanks for everybody putting this together once again, and Mr. Prophet, Mr. Owen for attending tonight. We don't get to hear them very often and have this kind of a work session, so it's definitely welcomed, but unfortunately it's depressing. You're hearing about big cuts coming to the city, and we have to adopt our budget next week, and we already have a plan B, and that's probably going to be like plan double B before we know it, with all the different changing things. And so we talked about the constitutional and the statutory funding that we received from the state. Mr. Prophet, you described some figures, and I didn't really get that. I don't know if I got them down accurate. 10.2 million, 7.1 million. the constitutional share being the 10.2 and the statutory being the 7.1. Is that correct?
1.7 for statutory.
That's for the city of Ann Arbor. That's
For the city of Ann Arbor, that's correct.
So
Yeah,
we
the
get
total-
10.2 million in the constitutional state revenue sharing, but just 1.7 in the more volatile statutory.
Yeah, it turns out, I mean, constitutional is pretty much sales tax, and it's not really legislatively determined. It's just a formula. So it really can't be impacted by the legislature, but it will be impacted because of the diminished sales tax revenue right now.
Yeah, I understand that as being a small business owner myself.
Yeah.
I'm sending in far less money. In fact, zero starting today or yesterday. So, but for us at the state, for the city level, just understand how we can better manage and plan. I'm not so, it's good to know that those numbers aren't inverted and that the smaller number is the more volatile sales tax figure versus the constitutional one. So that is a relief. I know it's bad, but at least that's a little bit of good news. I wanted to make sure I got that right. And then, Mr. Owen, you described the revenue coming from the marijuana tax on recreational excise taxes, and you described it in October. We'd be having a better understanding of what that more or less looks like. Right now, it's just too unclear.
Yes, thank you, council member. What essentially happened with the ballot initiative is that they were already rolling under the medical system, and so part of the initiative was they were going to have to relicense essentially every facility in the state under a new program. So what they did was they shifted in the ballot initiative. They put a 10% excise tax on all sales. So at the register, all sales, there's a 10% excise tax. At the retail facility, that money goes to the state, and it's divvied up within the ballot initiative. It was divvied up. First, there's 20 million that comes off the top, I believe, for a state program. I forget the exact language, and then each one of the departments essentially submits their costs on dealing it. And those departments, of course, only include the state police, the marijuana regulatory agency, licensing and regulatory affairs will have some small costs, but marijuana regulatory agency is part of that department. And then, of course, Treasury.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but in addition to the 20 million on top of the first 20.
Yes, the first 20, and I don't want to call it a study, but I believe it goes into some sort of research. And I can get back to you with the exact language.
That's fine. I don't need to get granular.
Yeah, in addition to the 20. And then, so the way that it will work, of course, the state's on a budget year on October 1. They'll figure out exactly what they were able to collect, what the expenses were for their departments, and then they will divvy that money up to the cities based on the number of facilities within each community.
And that number, that figure is less than 1 calendar year, correct? Because this went into effect after last October. So we're not dealing with a full calendar year of revenue in terms of that formula. You're dealing with
That's
9
right.
months.
That's right. And actually, the numbers will be greatly augmented specifically for the city of Ann Arbor as the larger cities come on board, because it's not a policy in which you collect from all the facilities from your community. When some of the larger areas in Oakland, Wayne, Macomb, etc., come on board and start producing significant revenues from that 10%, Ann Arbor will benefit more than they will today, because Ann Arbor has 18 facilities. That you won't produce the level of fees that, for example, a city of Detroit or so many different cities in that metro region will produce. Right now, you'll essentially be a donor community in that aspect, because there's several communities around the state that have several facilities all over the state, up north, Bay County, Saginaw, et cetera, that have several facilities within them, Flint, and they're not going to produce the revenue, believe it or not, that even the 18 stores in Ann Arbor will, which will be much more significant because the price per ticket will be much higher in the city of Ann Arbor. So as the Detroits, the Oakland counties, those stores start coming on and producing significant revenues, the number of facilities that Ann Arbor has per capita will allow for your pool to be bigger. And we anticipate most of those cities moving forward now that the rules are final. There were several city attorneys and city councils and other folks in these areas that made deliberate decisions early on to say, well, we'll just wait until the rules are out and finalized, and it's not emergency rule or draft rule, et cetera. Maybe that didn't have the type of economy of this nature like Ann Arbor did previously. They didn't have facilities that they needed to react to, and they had to start it from scratch. So they said, we'll wait for the final rule package and then we'll adopt our ordinance. And now that that's final, we anticipate between now and the end of the year, a lot of those ordinances being adopted.
Excellent. Let's go with Councilmember Lum and try to be done by 7:30 if we can, so we can get on to the other subject matter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilmember Lum.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Prophet, Mr. Owen, Mr. Fournier, for your excellent advocacy work on our behalf up in Lansing, and this update tonight. It's very informative, and even though there's not a whole lot going on up in Lansing right now, but thank you very much. Appreciate all your good work on our behalf. Quick question about the short-term rental zoning preemption. As you indicated, it's stalled in negotiations. And I'm wondering if you could just remind us who is at the negotiating table.
Well,
There's so many stakeholders, interested stakeholders. Right.
I would invite Kirk to help with answer this question as well. I know it's a big issue up in Lansing, but it's not as if there are committee meetings and things of that nature. It's simply being done behind closed doors with, involving the realtors and the hoteliers and things of that, people involved in those constituencies, and communities are involved in that discussion as well. But Kirk, do you have a better sense of who's contributing to those negotiations?
Yeah, I don't really think there's much negotiation at all about that right now. As you know, the hospitality industry has been devastated by this COVID. But before all of this started, there was pretty much a stalemate between hoteliers and real estate interests. The hoteliers said, "Fine, you want to do that? We're going to do this." And between their kind of competing activities, it basically blocked anything from happening on that legislation. So, in terms of prognosis, I don't anticipate you being preempted from trying to do what you want to do with that stuff. Certainly not in the near future. I don't expect the issue to go away. I think we're going to have to stay vigilant and attentive, but I don't expect those seeking to preempt you folks are going to have any success with that.
Yeah.
At least not in the near future.
Stalled is the word there. Yeah.
I would say this maybe even more broadly with in the context of COVID. I think there is an energy, with anything like this, and I think we want to look for opportunities with the energy from it to be aggressive and be and play offense. We've known for a number of years local government finance doesn't work in the context of Headley and Prop A. I think we use this as perhaps a platform to move forward. We've known for a number of years that the impact of many things that go on in American culture still have disproportionate impacts on more distressed populations, and especially as we've seen in this case in the 197, 198 zip codes, which are largely Black populations in that context. We see certain activities in the context of voting, and I know Jackie's been working very hard with the Secretary of State to try to correct that little bitty problem with your annexed property, but we might want to look for broader opportunities in the context of voting opportunities. I would say this in terms of variables to watch for as we go forward with your budget. There's the revenue estimate Friday. There's a revenue estimate in August. There's budget deliberations over the next few weeks. And I think we want to watch for CARES 4, if there is a CARES 4 or another supplemental coming out of Lansing. As to what's going to be allowed, there's going to be continued to be more things that are allowed as we go forward. I think the last thing, which obviously does impact Ann Arbor, are those large gatherings like football games, like concerts, like all the summer activities that are so popular and so successful in Ann Arbor. Obviously, those will be the last types of things to be able to take place. So, those are impacts that I'm sure you have to plan for, almost in the reverse. But I did want to mention the energy that comes from some of these things that we should use positively and start to play offense. I know one of the primary targets is cultural arts for many on council and in your priority list that you developed last year. We're already pursuing a different approach and perhaps a more coordinated and comprehensive approach with the executive office to cultural arts. Even though this legislature obviously can't do much right now, make no mistake, this executive office is working hard, 24/7. It's pretty much done through executive order right now. But I would watch for these opportunities to make things happen as you would want to do. Many times independent of the legislature. We'll work with it when it's there, but if it's not there, I think there's still things we can do, and we want to be in position to do so for you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. That is helpful and heartening, and we'll look for opportunities to be opportunistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to join you tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you both. Mr. Crawford, you have the con.
Thank you. Mayor, unlike the legislative area, the financial area has seen a lot of activity. So let me share some of that with you. Okay, everybody see that?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so there've been a lot of challenges with this COVID-19 pandemic, and today some of the things we're going to cover. I want to give you an update on the revenue shortfalls and what we're expecting. Also going to identify some potential actions that we can do to address those shortfalls. And we'd also like to listen to you and others on ideas that we haven't identified. And so that's kind of the overall plan for today. Hoping to provide you some time at the end of the presentation to have some conversation. As backdrop to this conversation, please recall that we're in the middle of our fiscal year 20, which ends June 30th. When we look at fiscal year 20, we had forecasted a use of fund balance of $3.5 million this year. That at the end of this year, then, this is excluding any COVID impact, we would have a fund balance of about $16 million or 17% of our expenditures. That is toward the center of our policy range, which is 15 to 20%. As this presentation is going to have a number of assumptions in it. These are assumptions, we had prepared them previously. We basically came up with an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario. We did it a little bit differently this time. Worked with Matt Horning and the rest of staff and came up with kind of a midline scenario. And then we applied a positive factor of, in fiscal 20, 5%, and I believe it was 10% negative to create a pessimistic range in 20. So up 5, down 10, if I remember correctly. In fiscal 21, because there's so much more unknown, we took our middle line scenario, which I'll describe for you in a moment, and then we went up 10% and down 25%. So that's how we kind of came up with the range. Again, the city's primary issues have been around revenues. The expenditure hits that we've had have been either minor or hits that we believe may be reimbursable by FEMA at a later date. So so most of this is on revenues. The revenue projections that we used, or the assumptions we used, were for the parking revenues from the DDA. I'm sorry, I think I have a window that might be obscuring some of your view. The parking revenues are projected to be down about 30% this year, and we're assuming 55% in 21. That really reflects a drop off in the demand for parking and a longer period of a lull before it really starts to come back. The parking fines are projected to be down a third both years. Fire inspection fees are expected to be down almost 60% in both years. That's in part due to some vacancies we have in the area. And then the city parks revenues has been really challenging, and this is still a little bit dynamic, but we're projecting to be down 30% for this year as the operations have been unable to come online, and about 34% next year. Lastly, these state shared revenues we've assumed to be down just a tad this year in our fiscal year, 3%, and then down 20% in fiscal 21. What I don't have on here, and what you're going to hear about in a moment, because we thought we'd do public services first this time, is our water and sewer assumptions are expected a drop off in our pessimistic scenario, and that's what all of this is, right? Is the lower end of the range, or I should say higher end of the revenue shortfall. Our water and sewer assumptions were a 40% drop. That assumes U of M does not have a football season and full on-campus activities do not return. And then on the Act 51 funds, we've assumed 1 to 3% impact in this fiscal year and about a 20% impact in fiscal 21. The numbers that we're providing in this presentation, as a reminder, were not designed to tie to our financial statements. They're taking the key elements that are the most dynamic, that are changing the most basically, and the ones that are most impactful, and just forecasting those revenues. We have also excluded any impact of federal or state aid. Those may be coming, but we didn't think it was responsible to put those in yet. So at this time, if Mr. Hupy is available, I was going to ask that he and Ms. Bashan touch base on the water funds. And I'm happy to turn the slides, Craig and Marty, as you go through them.
Thank you, Tom. Starting with the water fund, for the 2 years, 2020, the shortfall is estimated to be just a little bit over 2 million, and in 2021, 2.75 million. How we're going to deal with that and the activities that are going on in each of the funds. The water meter project obviously is not going forward. That requires us to go into people's homes to change out the meters. In the COVID situation, we will not be doing that, and we will be delaying that project until such time that we comfortably can go into the homes and change the meters. So in that first year, that is almost 2 million there, and 1.7 million in the second year. The acid injection system, a little background on that is we use a water treatment process that uses carbon dioxide liquid to adjust pH. Carbon dioxide production is an offshoot of ethanol production, which is used as a gasoline additive. With less miles being driven, the carbon dioxide market is tightening up. And so we are looking at designing, or we have designed and looking at getting a permit from DEQ to use acid to do the recarbonation of the drinking water. And that is the cost you see there, the $250,000 to set it up, and then probably $100,000 to run it if we have to run it into the second year. The sequestration overtime, if we go into sequestration, we hold people in the plant to keep them from being exposed to COVID. It is a little over 100,000 a year. We haven't gone fully into that, so we aren't seeing that expense yet. We delayed our UV disinfection process, which was a project started pre-COVID. And by delaying it, we did have a less of a spend in FY20, but we're going to come back and in FY21, we're going to have that spend reappear and a little bit additional more because we're accelerating it because it helps us with the acid injection system. We did receive a grant from Eagle for our PFAS works carbon, so that was unexpected revenue that helps offset it. We expect a savings in FY21 if the water usage doesn't come back. We'll have used less electricity and chemicals, so that will be a savings. And that's also in the next line, the electrical savings. Hiring freeze will be around 100,000 each year if we don't fill vacancies. We plan to delay the water treatment facilities master plan work. We were going to start that this year. We are delaying it, and we will start it probably in FY22. Or yes, in FY22. The Broadway water main project replacement, which was to happen in FY21, will also be delayed. So that gets us to where we need to be in the water fund on a very broad general overview. Tom, next slide. In the sanitary sewer fund, roughly $1.5 million this year and 4.8 in FY21. Again, the meter project savings, because the meters are, although they're water meters, they're paid for both by water and sewer fund because we generate our sewer billings off of those meters also. We will delay lift station rehab. We had 2 lift stations planned, Sequoia 1 and Sequoia 2 for FY21. We would slow walk those. We would delay the Southside Interceptor rehab, which we're in phase 6 of that project. That would be $1.1 million. Savings again because there's less flow through the plants, about just shy of $500,000. Asset management grant proceeds that we received a grant to develop our asset management plan, so that was a bonus. Restricting travel and training is a small savings. Plant electrical savings, again, less flow, less electricity. A hiring freeze will save about $100,000 in FY21. A sequestration overtime, if we go into that, would be a loss of about 110. And then we would be using fund balance in FY21 to balance everything out. Slide. In the major street funds, this year we're looking at being 161,000 short. Of that, the hiring freeze would save 90,000, and we have not been successful in the transportation engineering vacancy. That's 108, so that covers it for this year. Next year, we would delay the Broadway bridge repair project for $1.6 million. Delay equipment purchases for $300,000. Continue with a hiring freeze. Reduce alternative transportation funding. Normally, we transfer 5% of the major street fund to the alt transportation fund. This would look at transferring 2.5% to the alt transportation fund. Operation savings of 38,000. That is really the money coming back from the savings from the previous year, from 2020. Travel and training restrictions would be 13,000, and that gets us to the 2 million that we need to achieve. On the local street funds, a much abbreviated list. We will be short, in the worst case scenario, 61,000 this year. That would mostly come out of reduced maintenance to the roadways, 7,000 and a hiring freeze. In 2021, it would be 607,000, and again, the bulk of that will come out of reduced road maintenance.
So, thank you, Craig. So I'm going to do the general fund, and I just want to put this in context again. What we're providing you is a list of items that is not intended to be necessarily acted upon initially, because so much of the 21 is not yet known. Our thought at this point is we need to see what things look like as the state starts to reopen, what traction it gets, doesn't get, and then adjust accordingly. So all of these lists are being provided as an initial shot at what that might look like to work from. When we look at the general fund, and in the pessimistic scenario, again, this is 25% lower than in 21. It's 25% lower than we were kind of our mainline projection. These are just the revenue categories that I mentioned earlier. The first three columns represent 20. The second three bars represent 21. You'll see the yellow bar represents the revenue shortfall we're anticipating each year. So it's 4.8 and 9.8 million. When I put that into a chart, this is a little bit easier to read. What we've done is we've kind of categorized some recovery actions into groups. I've got them color-coded so that as we go through the following slides, you'd be able to tie them back to this. The first group that we came up with were crisis-related and unplanned savings. Those are kind of things that we just have to spend on. And then discretionary, are truly discretionary items, certainly from a council perspective. The capital projects, one thing you do during times like this is you consider delaying capital projects, some of which are more digestible than others. A hard part about that is that to some extent, government projects continuing provide some economic stability for your community. So it's a two-edged sword to the extent that you can move them. Generally, governments do. That's particularly challenged in this crisis. The debt-related activities, I'll talk about when we're there. Labor-related, these are all the activities somehow associated with our workforce. And then use of fund balance and the ideas that we came up with, given the short tenure we have here in 20 to deal with it, there's a projected need of $1.5 million of general fund balance. That comes off of the 16 million that I referenced earlier. In 21, we've got ideas in the ideation stage here that would more than get all the 9.8 million. So as we start going down through the list, this first group, the crisis-related unplanned savings, the first few lines are the items that were on the council agenda, I believe at the last session. These are, or more recently, these are items that you've approved to help the community respond to the stress that they're feeling, in addition to the other mechanisms that the other layers of government are providing. The middle line there for park temp employees, what we see here is a savings that's projected in this year because the operations are not being opened up. However, for 21, we believe there'll be some kind of cost impact as when they do open up, they'll have to operate with probably more staffing or a different way, given the additional attention that has to be paid related to the COVID activities. There was a legal settlement that's pretty much just timing of those proceeds. And then there's an opportunity for shifting some of our costs related to supplies that we had to buy related to COVID out of our risk fund. That would save the general fund some monies and allows us to aggregate our hopefully FEMA reimbursable expenditures in the risk fund. And lastly, we would save some money on some parking ticket processing fees. Moving to the next category, discretionary. One of the largest expenditures that staff has been gearing up for is this the master plan. In the fiscal 20, there's $500,000 in the budget that has not yet been expended. You've had a recent resolution, I believe you've received it already, for 300 and something thousand to round out all of the requirements and desires on that plan. This action here would defer that study past fiscal 21. So you take your savings in fiscal 20 and not incur the added scope. The center of the city funding, there was 140 that is remaining in fiscal 20. There was only 20 budgeted in fiscal 21. However, given the conversation from the other night with council's interest in continuing some efforts with the center of the city, I've added another 20,000 here. That's why it's a negative 20 for a total funding of 40,000 in 21 in order to allow some of the studies and engagement efforts to occur. On a tree line trail, fiscal 21 had $40,000 in it. This would remove that 40,000. That was primarily used for staff support. So that would put, if this were approved or move forward on, it would basically not have the staff support on that project for 21. Suspending the Parks Fairness Resolution, you may recall that Council has a longstanding resolution on file that the park system, as funded by the general fund, does not incur any reductions greater than the average of the rest of the departments. And we've interpreted that to work the other way as well. So when other departments get funding, parks get funding equivalent to the other departments as well. That is equated, it was over $300,000 in fiscal 20. Today, 126 of that has not been expended. I do believe there are some thoughts and some ideas that are in the works for utilizing that. But if we discontinued those efforts this year, there'd be 126. And then the city administrator's recommended budget has about $200,000 that it would imply would need to be funded through this resolution. This idea or this proposal is to suspend that for this year and next in order to retain that funding in the general fund. Crash mapping software is some software we would actually fund from forfeiture funds, or I believe it's forfeiture or IT. Energy audit, we had $25,000 in for fiscal 20. We would just delay that. There's not the staff to actually do those right now, so that would be a later date. The Deer Call has been a program that has met many of its metrics. However, council could consider taking a year off on that, and that's what this shows in fiscal 21. There's a total of $140,000 in that budget for that. There's $25,000 of outside legal services that was requested as an increase in 21. This is proposed to not include that. And then the historic district survey, which is needed for some compliance, it could be delayed. It's not an absolute necessity to do. On the capital projects, this section, these are many things you basically had included, or we had included in a recommended budget. It was the Hollywood Boulevard project is the paving of Hollywood Boulevard, and it has the support of the parties on the street. However, it's a sizable amount of money for the city to incur, so that could be deferred. The Ann Arbor Saline project is actually on hold. We've got some of the partners there are not moving forward at this time, which would not make sense for the city to continue in our view. You may recall that the city, we've got a policy for transferring monies to a capital sinking fund. This is really utilized to keep the maintenance on our facilities where they should be. This is, AC units, it's all the equipment, and it might be painting or those kind of things. We have $400,000 that we put in, removing that transfer for 21, but not changing that policy permanent. That would be a policy waiver, is a proposal for 21. Similarly, the streetlight replacements. Streetlights are an asset that degrade over time in the street. We've been trying to get funding. We've identified through modeling that the funding that's required each year is about $530,000 to be set aside. We've not yet grown into that. Both of these items, these last two items, are things we've been trying to grow into as resources were available. This is a proposal to take the $425,000 and not fund it. That is challenging in the perspective that streetlights will continue to age. The resident-driven sidewalk gap program has about $147,000 left in fiscal 20, and the administrator's recommended budget has $100,000 in. If both of those were removed, those would be sources of funds that could be retained in the general fund. And then if the university doesn't come back into session on campus, the satellite elections office may not be required. That's the $25,000. For the debt-related issues, it's primarily related to the retirement benefits. You may recall that your funding policy for the retiree healthcare moves up at 2% per year, or the amount of increase in revenues. This is what this would propose is to not fund the excess portion that has been going into the VEBA. You may recall that our VEBA trust fund has been increasing toward its goal of 100%. I believe we're around 72, if I remember correctly. That happens because we do make these contributions. The particular challenge on this one, just so you understand it, is if we do not make the contributions that the city makes in total is roughly the size of the claims that the city incurs. The city's self-insured, and so as these claims come in, we've been able to pay them out of our planned contributions. We have not had to tap the VEBA Trust Fund for any claims to date. If we do remove the supplemental contributions, we would have to start tapping into the trust fund, definitely by 21, in order to ensure that claims were paid. That is what it's designed to do. We just weren't planning to do that this early in the process. That's one frustrating factor about that. Another is that this is the time that you actually, from a financial perspective, you want to contribute when the market is depressed some and take it out when it's higher. So discontinuing contributions now may end up costing you more later because you might be making contributions at a time when you're not having the benefit of the earnings from these contributions. The story is very similar to the pension, but on a much smaller scale. There's only been about $500,000 of excess contributions, and those were really just put in through the budget in this year and next. We looked at whether or not there were other debt-related actions we could do, but Mr. Horning has been refinancing all the city debt that he could over the last few years as the rates have been low, and we have not been able to identify any debts, particularly related to the general fund, that even in these low rates, we could refinance in an appropriate way. On a labor-related items, the first one is a hiring freeze. And when I say hiring freeze, the concept here is that there's always, when you're managing the workforce, there are skills and positions that need to be filled for the situation that you're in, or the situation that you see coming. And so even though there's a hiring freeze, I would call it maybe a selected hiring freeze, where by default, positions are not going to be hired. And then by exception, the city administrator would approve some. So I've been through all of the open or vacancies now and proposed hirings, and got it down to about 10 that we would probably be hiring now. or continue to make efforts on. One of them, for example, would be the HR director position. The next line you've seen on a number of other slides is travel and training restrictions. Those are in place. However, I would point out that we will have some training expenditures as some of our employees have licenses that require ongoing credits to maintain their license and their ability to practice in best form. Third line is the overhire program that we've used kind of successfully over the last few years. This cuts it in half. There is a need still for the overhire program. I think this is cutting a little bit tight, but you know, you've got to do something. So this would put that stress into the system of not having as a robust overhire process. The next line has 3 positions: the sustainability fellow, a planning intern, and facilities temp, that would all be not filled through fiscal 21. There have been some reduced overtime from our change in operating deployments. We would continue that through 21. We have $97,000 in the recommended budget for inclusion training. My recommendation here is to leave $25,000 in and let that be support for staff to pick up this effort at this time. There's a lot of important work to do in this area to maintain a strong workforce and culture, and I didn't think it was appropriate to remove all of it. So this leaves $25,000 in for that. Voluntary furloughs is something that we're looking at. Conceptually, this is where employees might choose to work a reduced amount of time, say 15% of the time or half their time. That's a program we're still looking at. There are a number of TBDs here, or a couple of them, and that's where thoughts have been. We've got some thoughts around it, but not a plan. The incentive for staff reductions, this is a negative TBD, and the reason it says I don't really have any plans on this now, and the reason is when we've thought about staff reductions, incentives for staff reductions previously, we were a larger organization and we weren't as lean as we are now, and the incentive program works in a broad way. You make one plan, it's provided to the full group of employees, and individually choose to take it or not. As a leaner organization, that's much more challenging to manage because you can only really afford to have people leave in certain areas or in certain quantities. And still deliver your operations. So I put it on the list as an option, although I'm not quite sure that we would be able to do. I didn't want to put any monies in here because I'm not quite sure we'd be able to develop one that really would be effective for us from a workforce management perspective. We have used it successfully in the past, so it will, it's something on the table. But the next one is senior management voluntary non-permanent pay cuts. This is directionally, it is a 10% pay cut for myself, 7.5% pay cut for Mr. Postema, and 5% for the service area administrators. We would want to do that as demonstrating our leadership prior to our employees being adversely impacted in a material way. From a pay freeze is the next one. This is all of our employees not under contract, basically not getting a raise in the next fiscal year. Departmental restructuring, well, I don't have any plans for that now. That's a longer term effort that you work on. I do believe from my experience that we could find some savings there. I don't have a particular plan identified at this time, but I'm comfortable enough with it that I put $300,000 in. On the involuntary furloughs, layoffs, and/or pay reductions, this is equated to about the reduction of about 25 employees, or about a 5% across the board pay reduction. And this is all done on the general fund employees, just for perspective, since this is the general fund. This is where most of our activities are, and where, when we look at our revenue shortfalls, where a lot of the difficulty is. All of these are challenging. All of these, not just workforce, are all challenging things to deal with in one way or the other. Lastly, we have use of reserves, And on this slide, I indicated earlier that the $1.5 million is necessary in order to get fiscal 20 done. We would be down to about 15% of your policy minimum on the general fund unassigned fund balance. So I would look to not do that in fiscal 21 if we're able to not get there. However, we do have fund balance 4 times like this. And, depending on how things go, we may need it in 21 or 22. So, from my seat, it is acceptable to spend some, but not a lot as we go through really tough situations like we're in. This other line I left blank, it's transfers from other funds. This might be the risk fund to the extent there's some excess reserves. If we identify any, the county mental health millage, things like that, we could look at those. But again, I have not planned on any of those. This is the summary slide that you saw earlier. Again, I just wanted to bring it back in a full picture. Basically, if we got to the point that we think we're pretty close to hitting this in fiscal 20 of a $4.8 million loss, we have a way to get there. This, in order for us to execute this, we would have to come back to you with some resolutions implementing the policy waivers for particularly the debt-related things. And for fiscal 21, there's enough to get there, but there's enough, I would say there's still more work we want to do. Those are quite painful actions that we listed. And again, it takes a lot of funding. There's a lot coming from the employee base and a lot coming from the debt restructuring. So what do we do? How do we move forward when we're facing this environment? There's 3 things in my view. One is we've got to communicate. We want to communicate with you and keep you updated on how things are going. When we communicate, we have to know where we're headed. We have to have a direction, a North Star on where we're going. And from my view, that is our mission statement. Our mission statement is to deliver exceptional services that sustain and enhance a vibrant, safe, and diverse community. What that means is, and how I would view that being implemented, is as we make tough choices, we do it in the context that we don't overly jeopardize our mission. Anything that's not mission-driven, even if it is mission-driven, can we do it better? But things that aren't mission-driven are the things that are probably the areas we look at the most. And as we make tough decisions, the reality is we don't have a lot of fluff in our budget, and there are a lot of tough decisions to be made. And so some of the competing things that we would consider are how do we deliver our essential services in the most efficient and effective way? This is the constant continuous improvement kind of concept. We feel like we do that a lot, but these are times you've got to buckle down and find more. And we would be looking for those opportunities even more aggressively. How do we maintain a healthy and motivated workforce? We go through times like this, but it is true that the workforce is what gets the work done. We are an organization that primarily has employees as our asset to deliver services. And we need to have a healthy and motivated workforce to do a good job for the community. Doing all this, we need to ensure the long-term sustainability of our services, not just financially, but structurally. This goes to having money set aside for replacements, for having a good debt rating, credit rating, those kinds of things. And lastly, we can't forget the most vulnerable and how they might be inadvertently disadvantaged as we go through these decisions. And we need to evaluate our policy implications and make sure that they're equitable. As we look forward to the next couple of weeks, this is a very compressed time frame. It has tended to be, I'll have to say before I go through the slide, everything about this pandemic has surprised me, because as we start to walk into an event, we end up at the very worst case scenario. It seems like as we went through this, the first weeks has just been a constant churn of, well, geez, it could get this bad. And the next day it was that bad. And then the next day. So I say that not to say we're going to be at the worst case scenario, but I do think the worst case scenario is a possibility. I do see a lot of improvements occurring. I do think there is room for optimism, but nevertheless, even our mainline scenario is a very challenging environment. So you have basically a $92 million baseline of an operating budget when you eliminate the pass-throughs, and we're talking about pretty much a 10% risk of a 9 to 10% hit on that. That's major. As we go forward for the next couple of weeks, next Monday is our council meeting to adopt where you consider adoption of the budget. The budget does not include the pandemic. As I've mentioned here briefly, having a framework for how we approach decisions, giving us time to look at what's actually going to happen, because what we don't want to do is overreact and potentially take too much out to the point that it might jeopardize the good stuff that we are doing. And then, we've gone through these actions. Council's role then is to, we've got budget amendments coming up that really due. If you've got any this Wednesday, we're going to work with you with best efforts as late as you give them to us. But we also recognize you might have questions about tonight's presentation, and we're going to try to answer those as well. So it's going to be a busy week, and we've got the standard people to contact as you go through that. Sarah Higgins for the questions, and then Matt Horning and Ken Busselmeyer for the budget amendments. With that, we are open for questions. I'm going to take the screen share off. I'm happy to bring it back on if people have questions on a particular slide.
Councilmember Lum. Councilmember Lum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And first, I'd like to thank Mr. Crawford and your team and the city staff, Mr. Hubie, and everyone for pulling together, Mr. Horning. There's so many of you who've been working on this. I see you on the screen here. But thank you all the SAAs, Ms. Preshon, Meyer, yes, et cetera. You've been working feverishly. And so thank you for pulling together this financial recovery plan, getting it to us tonight and before tonight's meeting, so we had time to digest it. My take is that one thing that's clear at this point is that the city clearly faces significant but uncertain financial challenges from the pandemic. The proposed budget, 21 budget, is presented a month ago, and this is obviously through no fault of staff or anyone, is now outdated, and I don't view it as viable. Again, through no fault of anyone. It does have expenditure levels in the millions of dollars above the revenues to support them. Clearly, we're in uncharted waters. The clock is ticking on approving a budget. We'll be voting on the budget 1 week from tonight. And what we have before us is the detailed budget that was appropriately balanced when it was presented a month ago, but now it's just not viable with the deficits in the millions. And you've given us an excellent financial plan framework that is a very helpful framework, but it's not the revised budget proposal. I did send you a memo this morning with my thoughts and recommendations on how I believe we could proceed. And I do know from that memo I sent that I think the best approach is for council to approve a resolution related to the budget and recovery plan that could be considered in conjunction with the proposed April budget that we received from Mr. Crawford. And it would address recovery action plan actions and help by outlining some of council's expectations and guiding principles, if you will, regarding the recovery plan's implementation and objectives. And I do think that helps, that kind of approach recognizes the practical realities that we're facing and builds on the work that the excellent work that staff has done in developing this plan that we were just presented, and also helps provide the kind of council policy direction that's needed to navigate all of this. In talking to, or have some communications with Mr. Crawford today, he provided some suggestions on related to flexibility for staff, and I will incorporate that. Mr. Crawford and all, and I don't want to speak for Mr. Crawford certainly, but my sense is that he supports the approach of council providing policy level direction on this. And So you know what, I wanted to just give you a little bit of heads up, what would be covered in that resolution. I certainly recognize there wouldn't be consensus on the items, but again, just wanted to give you a bit of a heads up. And I know we'll be debating specific items. And anyway, I'm hopeful that giving this kind of policy level guidance on a recovery plan is a reasonable way forward. Because I really don't think that for us to simply approve an unbalanced, unviable budget next Monday without any policy direction on the recovery plan makes any sense, or is helpful for that matter. So, so just wanted to get that out there. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that the Washtenaw County COVID-19 local business impact survey, I think, is critical in the sense that it could help. The results from that survey could help guide some of our decisions on investment and support. And Councilmember Ramlawi is an excellent spokesperson at this table for that constituency. And I also think it's important we understand the challenges to our local businesses. And for folks out there, you can access this local business survey. Apparently, it doesn't take long to do. It's being done by a local research institution called Entry Point. So if you Google Entry Point, and also Spark is pushing it out in the community. So there's a Spark blog, and I just would encourage our local businesses to weigh in on that. I don't know, I have a couple DDA questions, if I may. And I don't know if Ms. Polly is, she's probably not. I see you shaking your mouth. So I will send in some questions on their budget, because I did send in a question about that. And so we've just gotten this detailed financial recovery plan from the city, but I'm basically wondering if a similar framework exists for the DDA.
The DDA has been, I can share that, well, I haven't been to their finance committee. I had my first board meeting the other day. They have been getting forecasts, and they reviewed what they look like, and they have been developing plans. The level of activity they do, so much of what they do is maintaining on the parking side, is maintaining the decks. That's where the real money is. It's in the operations and the capital, and the operations just stopped along with the revenues. And then on the TIF or economic development side, they've. I'm trying to remember. I'm not remembering off the top of my head what that discussion was, but they have been thinking through their budget similarly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because thanks. If you could then later on, Mr. Crawford, and pass this along to Ms. Polly, if they're on these recovery projections and plans that they've made or making, if those can be shared, I think that would be very helpful, because from what we've seen so far, it looks like the DDA's COVID-19 revenue impacts are far more significant on a percentage basis than the cities. And, given their revenue hits that they're projecting. So, I don't know what the hit is for 20, but in a response to a question, I was surprised to see that they indicated no budget adjustments were necessary. They were just for capital projects. So again, any recovery projections, plans that they have, if those could be shared with council, I think that would be helpful.
Councilmember Lam, as you say that, I'm remembering that they're working on those now, and I think they're about 2 weeks away, if I remember correctly, on having their recovery efforts presented to their group.
Okay, great, thanks. Quick question about the LDFA. What flexibility do they have through their MEDC charter to provide small business support or services directly through Spark?
They are prohibited from directly providing any support to a company. That's kind of an explicit limitation that they have. They are able to work through Spark for the permissive levels of activities. It's generally a highly restricted source of funds, and anything outside of what they do traditionally, we run by the MEDC to ensure that they deem it acceptable.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Councilmember Griswold.
Thank you for this presentation. I can't indicate strongly enough that we are in a financial crisis, and this presentation gave me some confidence that we're moving in the right direction. I did have a couple of questions. We talked about the water fund and also the sanitary sewer fund and having a hiring freeze. And I just want to make sure that any hiring freeze would not negatively impact the quality of those services.
The hiring freeze that we would be looking at would not necessarily be the direct operational folks. It might
okay.
be administrative support activities such as that. Some of it would be out, not in the plants. Some of it would be on the crews doing the collection and distribution systems. And it would be, say, a crew that's normally, say for sake of argument, 15 folks, it might be running at a crew of 14 folks or 13 folks. And that would be the folks that are doing maintenance on the systems out under the streets.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, thanks. And I sent an email in today to Tom Crawford, and I think it's important that we protect our core essential services as much as possible. And then I see that under crash mapping, there's some savings, and that is from not using the software anymore. Is that?
No, it's actually, we actually just, I'm trying to remember, I believe it came from the forfeiture. We're still doing it. We're just getting it from another source. It's either from forfeiture funds or another source. It's just not a general fund obligation.
It is forfeiture.
Forfeiture. Okay. And I would just say, and I've said this before, that we need to collaborate more with our other entities, such as SAMCOG, the University of Michigan, to see where there might be some savings. One thing that wasn't mentioned was the Lower Town traffic study. Has the consulting for that been, that contract already been paid? And how the actual project, how many more months will it be? I have a basic concern that we really can't study traffic patterns if we don't have much traffic right now. So can some of that be postponed?
Mr. Hupy, can you respond to that? Or should we come back?
Or I can wait and get a written answer. But I know that we have a number of consulting contracts that are transportation and traffic volume related. And so I'm just wondering if there could be any savings in those areas.
Okay, we'll get back to you on that one.
Councilmember Amlawi.
Thank you, and thanks to staff for putting this together. Thanks to Councilmember Lum for her comments you made earlier. Appreciate the support. And I did take that study that you were referring to. It was a well put together study, and I was trying to look for it so I could send it to our colleagues. But yeah, Spark has helped facilitating that, as they've been helping with other things here with the community. And you know, when we talk about the LDFA, I am the appointed council person for the board, and as Mr. Crawford alluded to earlier, there's a lot of restrictions in place of where that money can be spent. If it's not spent, it needs to be returned. It's very technical, and you know, one way that we did help out some of those local businesses is that back when we met in March, when this was all starting to break out, late March, we voted as a board to not collect rent from those startups inside the incubators and the sites that Spark, you know, occupies and pays the LDFA, or the LDFA just suspended collecting rent on those spaces. It was like 30 in the tens of thousands of dollars. But so we are trying ways to help small businesses and pay it forward, and as we've seen Spark do in other ways. So just a small comment on that. I just wanted to weigh in. I know we're short on time. The concerns I have with the water part of the presentation is that we've talked about delay putting in the meters. That was a significant investment that we were going to be making because we were told that the meters are going to be failing. This is something that I didn't think we had the discretion on postponing. So I'm just wondering how long that can be postponed, and whether there's any violations of contracts that have already been put in place. Are we losing anything? I'm surprised that we can just kind of pull the plug on that in such a program without penalty. And whether we're going to lose money with broken meters aren't registering usage.
Part of it is it's not the time to be going into homes, having people enter into homes and doing plumbing work in the basements, given the social distancing and COVID. So we don't want to be in the homes at this point. The desire is to start the project as soon as we can, but I would expect at least a year's delay in going in, maybe 2 years, depending on how long it takes to reach a comfort level to go into the homes.
And should we be concerned about losing some revenue on the other end? I understand that the health concerns.
Yeah.
But
There will be generally meters when they die in favor of the customer. So yes, there will be some loss of revenue. Will it be large? No, but it is an issue that we have to be aware of and move forward as soon as we can, both from a health standpoint and a financial standpoint.
And again, this goes to the UV system, the master plan for the water department. I mean, I'm just concerned that we might be pushing things off that may result in bigger costs later for us. Are there anything here that we need to be aware of by postponing some of these that seem to be just a solid number? Are they going to accrue additional costs because we delayed action?
You saw in the UV that it went up, I think, like 33,000 by the delay we had. That delay was because we did not want contractors in the plant when there was the highest risk for COVID, interacting with our staff. Now that that's down lower and we understand our risks a little bit better, we are moving that one forward. The master plan, we do need to do that, but we are not in regulatory jeopardy by delaying it a year or two.
Okay, thank you for answering those. I'm just going to jump real quick if I could, because I know my colleagues would like some time to speak. But when we look at the cost savings that we're trying to achieve, if I could say that, that when it comes to the debt-related cost savings, I would probably be in favor of that. I mean, I know that's going to raise my eyebrows, but just with the brief presentation that we were given tonight, and then thinking of where the economy is heading and where we're going to be buying in, I don't think we are buying in at a low period here. I think we'd still be buying in a high period. I don't think we're going to see the low mark for the Dow until probably 2022. So that is my 2 cents on that. And because and we have a lot of other choices we can make with the discretionary and then the use of reserves. I do have a quick question though. At the beginning, there was a brief mention of 3.5 million being taken out of the reserves for fiscal 20. Was that something that we planned on doing at the beginning of last year? I know if someone could shed some light why we're dipping in so much. I mean, is that we knew that we were going to be taking 3.5 million in a robust economy out of our general funds?
I believe the budget was closer to 700,000, and then there's been amendments through the year. Some of them were for reimbursable expenses, so some of them will either get reimbursed this year or the next. For example, on the Leslie, I believe the Leslie Science Center remediation. But there were just a number of amendments throughout the year that have added up.
Okay.
And I went back and looked to see if any of that money was able to come back, but it's virtually all been already used. If I could comment, if I could go back before to your debt comment, I wanted to highlight one distinction on the debt, just for your all's awareness. Doing the Viva Trust is one thing. It's a system that's largely closed, so liability is largely known to the extent our assumptions are accurate. The pension system, we have a hybrid system now, but that's an open system, which means, in my view, we have not made progress in the last 5 years in funding, even in the economy that we had. So I have a bigger, from a financial perspective, I would say, if you're choosing between the two, I have a bigger heartburn over not contributing to the pension system because it's an open life system and we really need to be putting more in. I think you've heard me say that over the last couple of years during budget times.
Even since orientation. Thank you.
Additional questions? I've got Councilor Griswold for a second bite. Is it anyone other who's Councilor Griswold?
I just have a process question. It takes 6 votes to pass the budget, but it takes 8 votes to pass an amendment. Is that correct?
It's actually 7 votes for the budget.
7 for the budget. Okay.
Six for amendments, and during the budget discussion, and then 8 anytime thereafter.
Oh, okay. So I have 2 concerns with passing a budget next Monday night. One is there is a lower threshold to pass it as opposed to an amendment later, and dealing with the communications, because I believe that council is going to look somewhat out of touch if we pass a budget that doesn't take into account the current conditions, even though we can't predict what the financial conditions will be in the future.
Councilmember Umlawi.
Thanks for allowing me to speak a second time. When we talk about passing the budget, and there's been some discussion about, what do we do because we know it's not going to stick. This is going to be a year full of resolutions, budget resolutions, and all sorts of things during our next cycle. But we don't have a choice in this matter, correct? This is a city charter thing. If council does not vote on this, it just defers to the city administrator, and it's not like we have much choice. We can't change the city charter next week.
On the process, you're correct. The number of votes and all that. I would say that the budget in government is a maximum number. Staff is not permitted to go over that number. Staff is permitted to go under that number. A little bit different than a private sector where it's a bit of a guideline and you can have the overruns. We have to kind of come back to you for those overruns. So staff views it as a maximum.
Councilor Grand, who has not previously spoken, Councilor Grand and Councilor Loam.
Thank you. I think Mr. Crawford just answered my question by making that point about the maximum so that staff could not move forward with something and not have to go to council to do so. Is that correct?
Yes. If it was a significant policy action, I would clearly advise and probably come to you for guidance. But there's a lot that I can do, for example, by not hiring, for example, that I can just do.
Okay, and I just want to extend my general thanks, and I guess I was going to maybe ask a follow-up question to you, but I know this was not the exercise that you wanted to be engaged in when you came on as interim city administrator, and I really do appreciate all the thoughtfulness that and difficult discussions that are behind what you gave us and your, commitment to having it be mission driven. I think that's really critical. So I do think that's part of it. I guess one of my questions to you is there anything else that you need from us next week, in line with the recommendations that you've given us? If there was some way that, to Councilmember Griswold's question, that would speak to just, an acknowledgement that we know that we're going to have to be making more decisions ahead.
Yeah, to the comments earlier, I really think the policy guidance on what you view as the most important things to focus on is helpful. To the extent that you speak with one voice on that, it's most helpful. I do think that as we move forward, the areas that we have to work on the most will be, we'll try to focus on what you guys identify. So.
Okay, thank you. I mean, from my perspective, what you gave us in terms of these recommendations is really in line with a lot of existing council policy. So and the city's mission, I just really appreciate it. Thank you.
Again, jumping to queue for first time speaker, Councilmember Bannister.
Hi, yes, I just wanted to follow up on slide 16 where I think Tom mentioned something about we weren't going to do anything with the county mental health millage. And I just wanted to ask again what that meant.
I didn't do anything with the county mental health millage as far those priorities that were established for that funding. I haven't done anything with separately. We looked at the 5 major funds in this presentation, which are the sources where the sources of revenues are jeopardizing the operations of those funds. It is true that the county mental health rebate millage is unrestricted funds, but I did not spend much time on that fund since it had already been through a prioritization discussion. That's all that I was saying.
So you're anticipating it'll remain 40-40-20.
That is present council direction, and I haven't spent much time on that fund, but I would expect that to continue unless I got other guidance.
Okay, and then that one back on slide 9 about reduced contracted road maintenance. Maybe that was Mr. Hoopy's area, but the contracted road maintenance, that was a little alarming because I was thinking the roads are in pretty bad shape. The local streets fund and the reduced contracted road maintenance. How was that? That was just something we would have to cut as not a priority?
Yes, it would be capital maintenance, the slurry, Cape Seal type projects. It might be some of the pavement markings might age more than we would like normally, but it would be cutting out or reducing our contracted services.
Councilmember Bannister, this let me float something here that's been discussed a little bit, and to get if you have the reactions to this, any of council. But one of the I hesitate to say the word opportunities, but one of the opportunities we have for pavement management is to potentially do some selected streets in the downtown with a mill and fill and get an improved pavement. That would actually, in order to fund that, we'd actually have to go into below our policy minimum of fund balance in Act 51. But if council has an appetite for that, that's something that staff has been talking about to try to get estimates and timing on. The idea is to take advantage of the time now when the businesses are not as active and not disrupt them later on when they are.
That sounds like a good idea.
I got Councilmember Nelson and then Councilmember Lum, then anyone else. And then remember, we're trying to get this completed to public comment in 6 minutes. Councilmember Nelson.
I was just curious, since we've had we've had a couple of budget agenda items, or I should say agenda items already, where we're trying to support the county in their efforts. I'm curious who's in communication with the county. How do we have any idea about any particular role we would play in the county as perhaps one of the more affluent towns? I was in conversation with somebody earlier today about this. Do you follow what I'm asking? I mean, we've now had a couple of budget items where we're sort of helping the county fund services that they need to provide. And I guess I'm curious moving forward if we have any sense of collaboration with the county or a role that we would play.
Well, let me, Mr. Delacourt may want to pipe in, but Mr. Delacourt has community development with him and interacts with the county kind of functionally through that role. I also periodically during this crisis have been talking with the county and some other agencies and understanding what their needs are and where a role might be for us. You know, recognizing that the residents of Ann Arbor are residents of the county as well and contribute to the county services. And Arbor has been a leader in providing supplemental support. And that's why I stayed in contact with them to see where that is. And we, you know, I would say discussions I've been part of have kind of narrowed into barrier busters and the sheltering as the greatest areas right now of support, but it's an ongoing dialogue. The latest information is barrier busters is not that I don't think we're on need to jump in right now with support. And again, I go back to the comments we heard, let's see, I guess several weeks ago now. You know, this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And if we stick to the things that we're good at, I'm sure the county will let us know when there is a need.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, it does sort of, because I just, I do appreciate the fact that we are leaders, and I because the whole county is suffering, I guess I feel strongly about us feeling like we're in a position to support people who are not as able to find support. I know that everybody's in a struggle now, but anyway.
Councilmember Lum.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just, whoops. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Just to quickly follow on, I thank you, Councilmember Nelson, for that question. I know for fiscal for 21, we had some initial estimates, of course, in terms of human services funding. Yeah, so if we could have some sort of, you mentioned shelter and barrier busters, but some best assessment what the funding requirements might be beyond the fiscal 21 proposal that we had in April for the shelter, the Housing Commission, or for the coordinated funding general fund contribution. I think that would be helpful. Whatever you could, you know, determine in terms of, you know, again, kind of a best assessment at this point would be helpful. Quickly, just to confirm in the financial recovery plan, of course, there was a deferral of the master plan update as fiscal year 20 savings. Just to clarify, because you might have stated this and I missed it, I apologize. If it wasn't put back in for fiscal year 21, does that mean, and again, maybe you said this previously, that it would be deferred until fiscal year 22? You're not in
yes.
Okay. So what does that mean in terms of the consultant and the process and all of that? It's all deferred.
Yeah, Mr. Delacourt may have some comments on that.
Yeah, I think if it's deferred to 22, at this point, those proposals would no longer be in good standing, and then we would start over from scratch with new proposals and a new scope, depending on where we were with the master plan and what the situation was at that point.
You would start over? Wow.
Well, there's no way those proposals are going to stay in good standing for 2 years. So when I say start over, I certainly mean with an RFP that competitive process will not be in good standing anymore come 22. Now, maybe the circumstances have changed as far as internal capacity. The update we were looking at was a sizable one. Maybe other changes or directions as a city at that time will necessitate a smaller adjustment to the master plan. I wouldn't know at this time, but what I can certainly say is the proposals that have been submitted to date, evaluated, and the recommendations brought to council would no longer be in good standing, and some process, if outside consulting work was necessary, would have to be followed.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Closing out before public comment, I guess I'd just like to say a couple of things. First, I would like to extend and echo my colleagues' thanks to staff. Obviously, that thanks goes back to the beginning of the crisis and really beforehand. But certainly putting together this plan, this articulation of savings that the organization can make during a crisis. We are, of course, we're looking at a very uncertain financial future, but at the same time, we also have a mission that we need to perform, and it will be our charge, our obligation to find that balance to affect the services both for present residents and future residents that is required of us, but at the same time in doing that in a manner that's financially feasible. And so I appreciate the work that staff has done to point us in this direction. I think we certainly, and I think members of the public who have been listening, and I think it's important that we continue to communicate that the budget presented to us is a pre-COVID document. It takes a long time to put together a budget of $168 million, and I'm comfortable moving forward with it because, of course, it is our obligation to do so, and I'm comfortable with a set of amendments that staff will eventually bring forward in accordance with their advice and our policy direction that we'll, as a council, need to affect in order to make sure that what we're doing for the residents today, for the residents tomorrow, we're able to do. So, thank you. We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and community about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. Speakers will have 3 minutes in which to speak, so listen to the clerk. The clerk will keep time and will announce when 30 seconds are remaining. When your time is up, you'll be placed on mute so that we may move forward to the next speaker. Members of the public who are interested in speaking at public comment may call the phone number on the screen. Enter in the meeting ID. Call-in should be displayed on your screen right now. Callers will be called on one by the city clerk using the last 3 digits of your phone number. You will hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. At that point, it is your turn and your 3 minutes have begun. When speaking, please move to a quiet area, mute any television or background sound so that we may hear you clearly. Per prior, the clerk will keep time and announce when 30 seconds are remaining. When your time is up, your speaking time is up, you'll be eventually placed on mute so that we may move on to the next speaker. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment?
Mayor, there's no one present for public comment.
Thank you very much. Seeing no one, public comment is closed. Let's take a moment to adjourn. I think if I recollect correctly, we have a closed session upcoming, but because it is a special meeting, we're not permitted to start it now. We have to wait till the appointed hour. Is that correct?
That is correct. Mayor, I do have one caller if you want to take them.
Thank you very much. Prior, the clerk will keep time and announce when 30.
Greetings, City Council. My name is Luis Vasquez. I'm a resident of the 1st Ward of Ann Arbor, and I would like to urge Council to suspend all funding for the center of the city. This, in my mind, is an unnecessary expenditure and low priority. And I would also then urge supporters of center of the city to redouble their efforts to raise private funding.
Thanks very much. Greetings, City Council. My name is Luis Vasquez. I'm a resident of the First Ward of Ann Arbor.
I think he's all done.
I'm taking that as completed. Mr. Vasquez, I assume you're done.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to speak at public comment?
Mayor, that's all.
Thank you very much. Seeing no one, public comment is truly closed. Let us adjourn and we'll reconvene at 9 o'clock for our special session. Thank you.
Welcome to the May 11th special session of the Ann Arbor City Council. Ms. Butcher, would you please call the notice of special session?
Notice is hereby given that a special session of the City of Ann Arbor City Council will be held electronically on Monday, May 11th at 9 p.m. for the following purpose: to hold a closed session under MCL 15.268D, the Michigan Open Meetings Act, for the purchase of land.
If you're able, please join us for a moment of silence, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Would our clerk please call the roll of council?
Councilmember Hayner,
Here.
Councilmember Bannister,
Here.
Councilmember Griswold,
Here.
Councilmember Lum, Councilmember Grand,
Here.
Councilmember Ackerman,
Here.
Mayor Taylor,
Here.
Councilmember Eaton,
Here.
Councilmember Nelson, here, Councilmember Smith,
Present.
Councilmember Ramlawi.
Here.
We have a quorum.
May I have a motion, please, to approve the agenda? Moved by Councilmember Lum, seconded by Councilmember Graham. Discussion of the agenda. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The agenda is approved. We now come to public comment reserve time. Are there any public reserve time speakers?
Not at this time.
All right, I don't see anyone on our, well, I guess it's, isn't it actually, is the note, is this general time or is this reserve time?
I'm sorry, the agenda should indicate general time.
Thank you very much. We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. In order to speak at public comment general time, the phone number and meeting ID on your screen should be called if you wish to speak to at public comment. Individuals who call the phone number and dial in the meeting ID will be called on one by one the city clerk using the last 3 digits of your phone number. You will hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. While you're speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sounds so that we may hear you clearly. The clerk will keep time. You have 3 minutes in which to speak. The clerk will announce when 30 seconds are remaining. When your time is up, you'll be placed upon mute so that we move on to the next speaker. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment?
Mayor, there's no one available for public comment.
Thank you very much. Seeing no one, public comment is closed. May I have a motion, please, to go into closed session for the purpose of, Mr. Postma?
As the clerk aptly stated, this is under the Open Meetings Act for a closed session under land purchase.
Thank you very much. Roll call. May I have a motion, please, to go into closed session moved by Councilmember Smith, seconded by Councilmember Ramlawi. Discussion? Roll call vote, please, starting with Councilmember Smith.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Ramlawi,
Yes.
Councilmember Hayner,
Yes.
Councilmember Bannister, Councilmember Griswold,
Yes.
Councilmember Lum, Councilmember Grand,
Yes.
Councilmember Ackerman,
Yes.
Mayor Taylor,
Yes.
Councilmember Eaton,
Yes.
Councilman Nelson. Yes. Motion carries.
We are now in closed session. So we're all to hop off of this Zoom and get onto the other Zoom. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are back in open session. May I have a motion to adjourn, please? Moved by Councilmember Smith, seconded by Councilmember Hayner. Discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned.